John Smith, that self-baptizer that we knew in England. Well, Roger works in Plymouth for a while, and then Salem calls him back in 1635 to be pastor there. And he starts preaching there some ideas that the authorities in Boston just don't like. One of the things he preaches about is how the settlers stole the land from the Indians. The truth hurts. And generally we don't like to hear the truth when it's like that. Of course they took the land from the Indians. If you read any early history, the Native Americans welcomed them at Plymouth because they thought they were going to treat the land just like the Native Americans did, which is the land belonged to no one. They just stayed there some and moved on. And they had no idea that these settlers were coming to stay and take more and more land. Then Roger Williams also pointed out that Church of England ministers weren't true ministers because that wasn't, well, that's not very popular either. And then he started preaching something radical called separation of church and state. That the church should have nothing to do with the state and the state should have nothing to do with the church. So he was brought up on these charges. The authorities said, look, you are going to be banished. Now, when I was young, I used to think banishment, they just sent you out to die. They didn't. Banishment meant you just couldn't be in that colony. You could find another place to live, but you weren't going to be around them. It would be like if you got irritated with somebody here in Clifton and you said, we are banishing you, you might send them to Waco. You know, good luck, go somewhere else. But these authorities were heartless. They said, we know your wife is pregnant and winter is coming. As long as you don't say anything, as long as you just keep your mouth shut, you can stay in Boston, or actually in Salem where he was, over the winter. But alas, Roger could not keep his mouth shut. So he starts preaching again, and then he and Mary have to flee to avoid arrest, and they flee into the woods and stay with the Native Americans who he had ministered to. Roger Williams was one of the first missionaries to Native Americans in the colonies. And they gave him refuge during this time. He goes down after he stays with the Native Americans over the winter, and he finds a plot of land south of Boston. And he likes it for a colony. So he goes to those Native Americans and he says, I want to buy this land. And he pays them for that land, and he establishes the colony that he will call Providence. And he founds it on religious liberty, that all are welcome there. You can go to church or not go to church. You could be a Church of England person, you could be a separatist, you could be anything. And you can come to Providence. He was just out of the reach of the Boston authorities. Well, he founds a church there in 1636, and he's gathering people. Then, as this church is kind of getting off this ground, a woman comes to town called Anne Hutchinson. A woman. Oh yeah. You know, there's danger when women get involved. And he points out to Roger that what he's talking about, the church that he's talking about, really, she thinks he's headed towards believer's baptism. Now, Anne was an interesting woman. She had come to Massachusetts Bay with her husband, and she had started to lead Bible studies there. Now, she really emphasized this inner spirit, almost a Quaker-type understanding of the Bible. And as long as she was having these Bible studies with women, the authorities didn't care. And they were really pretty big Bible studies in the Massachusetts Bay Area. But then, men started to come to him. And once the men started to come, then the authorities were like, well, we don't know about this woman leading Bible studies with men there too. And they brought her up on charges. And she said, literally said to them, "What? Can you tell me what I've done wrong?" And eventually, they banish her, and she ends up going to Providence, to that area. She talks to Roger, she says this to him, and so the church there in Providence in 1638, early 1639, and some historians go back and forth exactly when it actually happened, they have a meeting of the church, and they decide that they want to reconstitute their church on believers' baptism. Does this sound familiar to you all? Yeah. Only they decide, hey, how we're going to do it. If we're going to have somebody baptize somebody else, if Roger Williams isn't going to baptize himself, they pick Ezekiel Holyman, who is the oldest member of the congregation, to baptize Roger Williams, and then after Holyman baptizes him, then Roger will baptize Holyman and everyone else in the congregation. Now, the interesting thing about this is in the diary of Governor Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts Bay, he writes in March of 1639 that he had heard that one Anne Hutchinson and her sister, Catherine Scott, who had been infected with Anabaptistry, which, you know, re-baptizers, had gotten to a one holy man. And he spells it holy man. And that he had baptized Roger Williams and baptized everybody else. I mean, he puts that in his diary. Like he's worried. He's saying, guys, this is happening. Because that's what they saw the Baptist church as, an infection that could spread and affect them. Again, because what Roger Williams was preaching, what John Smith and Thomas Helmuth had preached in England, was a church that was free of the state and based on believers' baptism. And any church free of the state to the authorities rocked the foundation of their world. And I mean, it just wasn't in America, it just wasn't in England, it was everywhere. One of the reasons why Martin Luther is almost killed and other reformers were killed was to have a church that was different was dangerous. And the most different church out there was one that the state didn't control at all. They were scared of the Anabaptist. They were scared of the Baptist in England, and now they're scared of the Baptist here because they can't control them, and the state has no say over it. If you're wondering about Anne Hutchinson, you know, the authorities, where she lived in Rhode Island, the authorities will eventually think, hey, you're close enough to Boston, we can arrest you again. And she will then flee Rhode Island and travel to New York, where she will actually get caught up in between a fight between Native Americans and settlers out there, and she will die in a massacre. I often wonder how American Christianity might have been different had Anne Hutchinson survived. When you read accounts about her, you cannot help but think of Beth Moore. Everything about her as a teacher and her appeal and as it grew reminds me of Beth Moore and how her ministry grew. Well, Anne disappears from the scene as a result of an Indian massacre in the early 1640s. Now, you know, I told you that William Brister said Roger Williams reminded him of John Smith. Well, there might have been another reason for that. Because you see, just a few months after they created that first Baptist church, Roger will leave doubting his baptism. Just like John Smith. He will become, the rest of his life, he'll become a seeker. When Roger Williams dies in 1684, he will by that time determine that the only people who truly understood the will of God were he and his wife. He will stay friendly with the Baptists his entire life. In fact, he'll go over with a man I'm about to introduce you to, John Clark, in the 1640s, while England is suffering a civil war, and that's when they secure the charter for Rhode Island. And so he works with the Baptists. He's very familiar with the Baptists. He thought Christianity was too big to be housed under one tent. That's how he would say it. But his works, called A Bloody Tenet, A Bloody Principle, and A Bloody Tenet, Yet More Bloody. You know, how's that for a sequel? Those are two of his famous works on religious liberty, where he tries to tell people, you don't have to be afraid of a church that is not run or overseen by the state. Again, just like Thomas Hell was way ahead of his time. But Roger's thing was, he'd set up his colony. And so he didn't have to worry about being arrested. And Rhode Island did become a haven for people seeking religious liberty. Today, if you go to the state of Rhode Island, about 90% of Rhode Island today is Catholic. And you might wonder why? Well, because when the Catholics immigrated to America and they were persecuted, the one place they weren't persecuted, Rhode Island. So they found a safe harbor there. But in Providence, Rhode Island, to this day, that First Baptist Church in Providence meets every Sunday. They don't call themselves the First Baptist Church of Providence. They call themselves the First Baptist Church in America. How's that for being a little cocky? You know. Sarah and I went there. We were in Providence a few weeks ago, and I'd always wanted to worship at that church on a Sunday morning. And so I told Sarah, we're going to go Sunday. We go, and as we're driving up, park in the car, it's always a little nervous to go to church where you don't know people. We see them putting chairs on the lawn. And Sarah's like, they're not even going to worship in the sanctuary today. You know, we're not going to get that experience. Their sanctuary was built in 1774. We're not going to get the experience of their sanctuary. I'm like, that's okay. You know, we're still going to be among the congregation in Providence, Rhode Island. So we get there, and these ladies welcome us and give us a seat, and one of them turns and says, I am so sorry, our pastor's not here today. But she's at the North American Peace Fellowship. And I'm like, now I don't even get the pastor. We're on the lawn without the pastor. And she said, but don't worry, our music minister is in charge of the entire service today. So he'll be bringing the sermon and the music. We did 5 responsive readings in that service. I hadn't done 5, I may not have done 5 responsive readings in the last 20 years. And we did 5 in one service. But you know, as we were sitting in that service, everything arranged, we were sitting on the lawn, I thought, here we are in Providence, Rhode Island, at the First Baptist Church in America, and there's not a whole lot of difference between a worship service here and if I was worshiping in countless churches across Texas. The gospel was proclaimed. Songs were sung, responsive readings were read, but the gospel was proclaimed. So that's Providence, Rhode Island. It's a beautiful church. If you ever want to see what that church looks like, go to Dallas Baptist University. Their chapel, which is 4 times as large as the church, on the outside looks exactly like the First Baptist Church in America. They built it to look like that as a replica. And I will tell you that that church, First Baptist Providence, Rhode Island, it has its struggles and it has its controversies over the years. But because it was kind of an unstable church in so many ways, and because Roger Williams was certainly a little unstable since he leaves the church, some Baptists have been more comfortable identifying the church at Newport, Rhode Island, as the First Baptist Church in America. And that was a church that John Clark, a physician, will come to in 1641. But historians will point out that there was a church there in at least 1638, 1639. Most of them don't believe that was a Baptist church yet. They don't believe it turns into a Baptist church and reclaims believers' baptism until 41 to 44. Not quite sure. But when we celebrated the 350th anniversary of the Baptist Church in America, back in the 1980s, what they did was they celebrated part of it in Providence, Rhode Island, that everybody got on buses and rode down to Newport so all the Baptists could be happy. You know, again, there is nothing like the Baptist Church. But John Clark was an interesting guy. He too had come in contact with Ann Hutchinson when he first came to Boston. And he saw what they were doing, and he was a little leery of her emphasis on this kind of mystic, almost inner light kind of thing. He did like the fact that she was fighting for separation of church and state, but he'll come down to Rhode Island, and he'll set up and will eventually become Newport. He'll help establish that church. He develops a friendship with Roger Williams, but he was known to go in and out of Boston from time to time. And one time, when he's traveling up to Boston, he's traveling up there with two other friends. One of them is a guy named Obadiah Holmes. They preach in someone's home in the Massachusetts Bay, Boston area, and authorities find out. Well, that was illegal. You couldn't preach in someone's home. You couldn't do that, and you certainly couldn't do it if you were Baptist. So they were arrested. And they went before the judge, and the judge said, and John Clark tries to give a spirited defense as to why they should not be found guilty. You know, and it's about as successful as you giving a spirited defense when you get a ticket and you go to traffic court. You know, that rarely works on a judge. It didn't work here. They're all found guilty, and they have their choice between paying a fine or 30 lashes. John Clark and the other man pay the fine. Obadiah Holmes has someone offer to pay the fine for him and says, nah, I'm not going to do it. They said, you don't understand. If you don't pay the fine, you will be beaten on the back with a whip 30 times. Pay the fine. He says, no, I'm not going to pay the fine. So they said, okay, even as they're taking him out to tie him to the post, they're still saying, pay the fine. No, he won't do it. They strip the shirt off his back and they start to beat him. He will later say that there was just such a peace came over him that he didn't even feel the pain. At the end of it, 30 lashes, the skin is ripped off his back. He turns to the guy who beat him and said, you have struck me as with roses. I mean, I don't know how that would make me feel. Let me just say that when my dad, my dad did spank me when I was a kid. And if I turned to my dad and said, you have struck me as with roses, I am pretty sure I would have bought a few more licks after that. But what a powerful testimony. At the moment of that event, John Clark writes an account about that. We'll call it Ill News from New England. Writes about the beating of Obadiah Holmes. That small book is published, and it makes its way to England. Now, England in the 1650s is going through first the Commonwealth and then the Protectorate under Cromwell. I mean, they are having a taste of democracy and certainly religious toleration. People read that account in England in horror. That is how people are being treated in America because of their faith. When years ago, when Sarah and I were in Newport, I went to the Newport Historical Society and I told them I really wanted to find the grave of Obadiah Holmes. They said, well, it gave us directions to it. Every cemetery is old in Rhode Island. And so we find this small cemetery behind the subdivision. And most of if you've ever been to New England, a lot of the headstones there are made of slate. And through time, they're almost unreadable. But Obadiah Holmes' tomb, or his headstone, is very clear. I mean, it almost looked brand new. And so maybe somebody had redone it. But I remember walking in that cemetery, standing in front of his grave and wondering if he had any idea what that one act would do in the history of the Baptist Church. Because to me, it calls and reminds us that when we talk about religious liberty, when we talk about religious freedom, it's not just some kind of ethereal concept. That people have been beaten and people have died to defend the right that you and I have to be here today and worship however we want to. That is the gift of Obadiah Holmes. And so I just stood there and said a little prayer. Well, thank you for what that one man did. Now, he may have felt like he was struck with roses. I will tell you that, it took him a week to convalesce there, and he got word he had to scurry off to Rhode Island because he got word that the authorities were coming to arrest him again. And he'll go on to be a very successful Baptist preacher in Rhode Island and the colonial area. But those are the beginnings of the Baptist Church in really America. I do want to tell you one thing, and Lindy, you may remember this. Does anybody know? I always ask this question in my class and tell them, if anyone can tell me the answer, and it's not an answer you'll find in any book, it's only in my mind. But if you can tell me this answer, you'll get an A in class. And that is, think of the size of the state of Rhode Island. Does anyone here know why Rhode Island is a state in the United States? And you will never forget this after tonight. Because without the state of Rhode Island, we would have no way to describe the size of natural disasters in the United States. Think of how many times you hear on the news, the wildfire is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. It's never Delaware, it's never Vermont or New Hampshire, it's always Rhode Island. So they ought to get that put on their license plate, Rhode Island, the disaster state. Well, I do want to say a word, and I'm going to open up for questions in just a second, a word about how Baptists really grew in America. We have these churches start in Rhode Island, and then we'll have some churches start in Pennsylvania and other places. But what really made the Baptist church explode in America, this is hard to admit, maybe you quote me on this outside, I'll deny it, but it's because of the Methodist. It's because of a man named John Wesley and his friend George Whitefield. And when George Whitefield comes to America and will start what we will call the First Great Awakening in 1740, that revival will save so many people. 1/6 of the entire American colonies will come to know the Lord as a result of that revival. And so many of the people that come to know the Lord, then they're known as New Lights in the Congregational and Church of England in the colonies because they're excited about revival. And so after the revival is over, they go to their churches and they want more. And the churches are like, you're crazy. You're way too emotional. That's not how this works. They even go to regular Baptist churches because then they're convicted that believers' baptism is what the church should be founded on. And the regular Baptist church, the established Baptist church at the time, says, no, we don't get that emotional either. And they end up creating their own form of the Baptist church. They're called Separate Baptist because they're fired up, because they're evangelistic and they believe in missions. And that group of Baptists, they will have so much passion and so much fire for the gospel that by 1800, the Baptist church is one of the largest denominations in America. But the catalyst is a Methodist revival. And I said, it's hard to admit. And what will happen is, as a result of that Methodist revival and this rise of separatist church, you get a church in Sandy Creek, North Carolina, that's formed. And that church will become, in many respects, the mother church of Baptists in the South. The way it is set up, the way preaching is casual, the emphasis on a casual approach. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a church in South Carolina that was established before them in Charleston. And they're all orderly. And they're all formal. The pastor in South Carolina will wear a robe. The pastor in North Carolina will be casually dressed. Because of that, today, you could go in a 50-mile radius of this place right now, and you can go to a Baptist church where a pastor will be wearing a robe on Sunday, and they'll follow the liturgical calendar. Or you can go to a Baptist church where they're wearing jeans and boots, and probably preaching in a bar. And they're all Baptist churches. You know, that's who we are as Baptists. Because we give a lot of freedom on how we worship, but again, we go back to the gospel. And the gospel is proclaimed. You know, I tell you, we're kind of the lint brush of Christianity in so many ways. It was Martin Luther that first changed the way we saw the worship service to make the worship service be where the gospel was proclaimed. And that's been the cornerstone of every Baptist church since that very first one was formed in Amsterdam. And certainly since the first one was formed in America. With that, I've got about 10, 12 minutes. I want to throw it open. If you've got any questions from last week or this week, yes? That's a good question. Free will Baptist, actually, this is a good sign of how Baptists have just emerged. So free will Baptist, which is the concept that, you know, basically free will Baptists will unfortunately turn into universalists in many places because they will believe that almost anybody can be saved. They will arise in the 1700s in New England, and they are still, you know, free will Baptists are everywhere across, in small groups. Another group of Baptists that arise about the same time are the Seventh-day Baptists. Anybody ever heard of a Seventh-day Baptist? So if you're wondering, yes, the Seventh-day Adventists got the idea from the Seventh-day Baptists. We had it first. The Seventh-day Baptists actually started in Rhode Island as a split off the church there in Newport. So even in the earliest days of the Baptists in the 1700s, we're splitting already over how we see theology and when we do worship. So when you are part of a free church movement, every church is free. And certainly Baptist history shows that churches exercise that freedom. Other questions? Yeah.
Can I go free Baptist now?
Go ahead.
What?
We had this discussion last week.
Yeah, I'm not a free will Baptist.
I said free Baptist. You
Yeah,
said-
I am a free. Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned separation of church and state.
Yes.
Would you address how the Baptist influence?
Oh, absolutely. This is one of my. If I had more time, I'd go to a long, detailed story. But the Baptist, it started first in Massachusetts with a man named Isaac Backus. Started fighting the man, fighting government over their laws that limited freedom of religion. And one of the tactics that he'll use in the 1770s, right before the revolution, is he'll come out and say, guys, you're taxing us without representation. Which would sound very familiar to anybody from Massachusetts who threw tea in at Harvard. And if you don't stop it, we're going to go to England. And we're going to tell the king what you're doing. Well, since we were basically planning a revolution at the time, no one really wanted the king to get involved with what was going over here. So they start putting up with a lot of stuff that Baptists are doing in New England. And after we get our freedom in the Revolution, it's going to be a Virginian named John Leland that's going to pick up that fight. Because he's going to go to his friend James Madison, who one of the best things Thomas Jefferson ever did was write the law in Virginia for the freedom of religion. In fact, if you go to Monticello today and you look at his tombstone, when you think he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was President of the United States, he was Secretary of State, he helped found the University of Virginia, the first thing listed on his tombstone is the author of the Freedom of Religion Act of Virginia. Well, Madison was his buddy. Leland said, hey, we want the same freedom for the country that we've gotten in Virginia now. That everyone can worship as they want. So when the Constitution comes around to be ratified, if you want to go to that meeting, you better promise us you're going to get that done. And James Madison kind of blows the Baptists off at first. And Leland said, you know, there's enough Baptists in this county that if you don't back us, we won't, or if you don't do this, we won't support you, and somebody else will go to the convention. Then your wife will make those cupcakes we all like, you know. And so he does. He goes, I'll get to it. Well, he goes to the convention and finds out you can't amend the Constitution. And so Leland goes back to him after that and says, well, when you go to the first Congress, and he goes, I got you taken care of. So that First Amendment to our Constitution that says Congress shall make no laws establishing religion or the free exercise thereof. That has Baptist fingerprints all over it. And it doesn't get in the Constitution without Baptists twisting a politician's arm and saying, we want strict guarantees that we have the freedom to worship the way we want. So,
the separation of church and state is not mentioned in any of our government documents.
Yeah.
Go to that, address that.
Well, do you know where separation of church and state is, that we know where the wall of separation is first mentioned? Anybody know?
That's what I want you to
Okay.
know.
Where?
Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist.
That's right. That's right. He's writing a Baptist church. He's writing the Danbury Baptist because he liked the Danbury Baptist church, because he liked the way they were set up. He would say that the Baptist church was one of the purest examples of democracy he could find. And so when the Danbury Baptists are concerned about what government might do in the Constitution and or might be interpreted, it's Thomas Jefferson that writes them and says, no, this is how it's set up. In fact, Thomas Jefferson did such a good, I'm going to start rambling, so you better reel me in. Thomas Jefferson did such a good job defending the Baptists that in 1802, when he and John Adams are at it in a presidential campaign, Adams supporters will call Thomas Jefferson an atheist because of Thomas Jefferson's belief in deism. And he realized he was not active in church. So they'll try to play the atheist card. And it's the Baptists who come and support Thomas Jefferson because they knew they didn't really care about where he was going to church. They really cared that he was backing religious freedom so that they could go to church. And as a result, John Leland, who had now moved to Massachusetts, is going to get all the farmers around him gathered together because they want to make a thank you gift to Thomas Jefferson. So what do they make him? What?
Monticello.
No. Anybody know? A big wheel of cheese.
Far from Monticello.
A 1,200-pound wheel of cheese. One of the reasons we use the term the big cheese today is because of that cheese. When it is delivered to Thomas Jefferson, because he would not take gifts, it's delivered to him in 1804. He pays $200 for that wheel of cheese. That was a lot of money back then, because he did not take gifts. That wheel of cheese hangs around for years. Somebody noticed a few years later, it was the guest of honor at a 4th of July picnic when it was long past good. It's also reported that that wheel of cheese was eventually cast into the Potomac where I am sure it is there to this day. But yes, we Baptists, I mean, what else would Baptists do but give a thank you gift of food to anyone? So they gave him the big wheelchair. But we really are. When it comes to separation of church and state, it is the Baptists that are so responsible for this protection. And one of the things that gets me sometimes is I have heard some politicians say that, oh, but separation of church and state isn't mentioned in any of our documents, any of our governing documents. But then I want to go back and say, yeah, but when one of the guys that we talk about interpreting our government documents, when he looks at it, he says it's there. And who does he tell? He tells the Baptists, relax. There's separation of church and state, and no one's coming after you. That's exactly why he tells them to the Baptists that way. Okay, one more question. Yeah.
So I think we all learned early in our school years that the early settlers came here to escape persecution, religious persecution. That was no guarantee when they got here. They still had to fight for that and break it because there was persecution when they got here.
Well, and the other thing that you need to know about that is they came here to escape religious persecution of their view. Because the very first thing that the Pilgrims do is persecute people who dissent from them in Plymouth. So, I find that very interesting that Plymouth, they come here to be able to be separatists, but then if you're not a separatist in Plymouth, you're persecuted. And in fact, a great way when Sarah and I went to Plymouth years ago, they have a reenactment village in Plymouth now that is supposed to be Plymouth in the 1650s. And so we went in, and I said, we went into the vicar's house. And, these people have studied their character for years so that they can answer any type of question. And I walked in, I'm looking at the vicar, and I said, what can you tell me of John Smith? Because again, the Pilgrims were together with John Smith back in Gainsborough. Well, this guy had obviously studied on John Smith. He'd been waiting years for anyone to ask this question. Because he starts dropping knowledge about John Smith. And now, the first thing he says to me is, I didn't know him personally. But here's what I've heard. And it was very interesting to hear his account of basically the rise of the Baptist church with John Smith. And he really leaned into the learned man and of good ability but unsettled head. Basically that John Smith was a kook. And so, yeah, one of the things that we need to realize about these early settlers in America, they came over to escape persecution of their views, but unfortunately, like so many Christian churches throughout history, the first thing they do is turn around and persecute other Christians that don't hold their views. And that's a sad commentary, because they are going to be the ones who will persecute the Baptist churches in Massachusetts, in Virginia. In Virginia, before Baptists are even called Baptists, one of the first taxes that they passed in the colony of Virginia in the early 1600s is a tax that is listed as those who will not have their children baptized as infants have to pay an extra tax in tobacco. Well, who would those people be? They'd be us. Before they could even know what we're called, they passed that tax in the 1650s because Baptists would not have their children baptized. So, with that, I'll stop it there to give you time to do your other business. And I will say that next week, I'm going to talk about how we started in Texas. And I hope you've enjoyed the stories that I've brought up, because every single place Baptists start, it's interesting.